For centuries, education has been both a tool of empowerment and a weapon of control. From colonial curriculums that shape minds to serve foreign interests to the struggle for an African-centered system that speaks to our identity, our history and our future, education has always been at the heart of our liberation. But here is the big question: can revamping Africa's education system be the real key to decolonization across Africa? Can rewriting the curriculum, reclaiming indigenous knowledge and reshaping our learning institutions truly drive meaningful change? Today, we dive deep into this pressing issue plaguing the African continent. What will a decolonized education look like? Will stand to benefit or resist such a transformation within the continent of Africa? And most importantly, can reimagine how we teach and learn finally unlock Africa's full potential? A question that has been at the center of numerous debates. This is Talking Point, and the conversation starts now. Hello Africa and the world, thank you immensely for joining us on a fresh dose of Talking Point over your Pan-African channel for you Media Africa. Today we're discussing decolonizing the minds of Africa, decolonizing the African continent, where at this point in time we pick interest in the education system, as a topic that has been at the center of numerous debates across the continent. And of course, at this day, we ask ourselves the question, will decolonizing the minds in Africa, lead to a change? Could revamping the education system lead to some significant change across the continent? I shall be discussing this day with Dr. Stanley FONGOD in his capacity as a Pan-Africanist, an economist, and the CEO of FINTECH. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Sharon. Thank you for having me.
Well, since we're discussing, this very critical topic on the
Africa to become an administrative tool for whatever it is that those colonial masters wanted to do on the continent of Africa, we were not trained primarily. Our education was not focused on, our cultures, our language, and our values. It was primarily a very Eurocentric approach, to education, and that's why if you had studied on the continent of Africa, you will soon realize that you were given European history, not African history. You were told about the great monarchs of Europe, their successes and failures, and little did you know anything about, those who basically rule Africa. You were not told anything about kingdoms like, those of Kemet. You were not said, nothing was ever told to you about the Benin Empire. You didn't know anything about the Sangha Empire, nothing about Makambubu in South Africa, nothing about the Great Zimbabwe. All you were told was something that was pertaining to the greatness of Europe. And so this is a complete divorce from who we are, and almost every single culture across the world, every country, was given their history. They taught their history, from their own perspective. But when it came to the African, we were given a curriculum that had nothing to do with us. And so the legacy of colonialism had continued on the African continent, and that has translated into not just our education, because if you're really trying to build a future, you need to be able to transform the minds of the people in which it is that you're trying to build a future with. There will be no prosperous future if the mind is not aligned with the future, that you want. So obviously, that has affected us also on the economic front. Politically, we are not doing any better, and we are nothing else but a leftover of whatever the colonial masters intended for us to be. So now that we are trying to build a better future, you cannot build a better future if you will not be able to redefine your philosophy. I've forgotten the songwriter. He says he doesn't care who runs a nation. He is not interested who is the leader. He is only interested if he writes its songs. And the reason for that is because if you can be able to basically hold a people philosophically and psychologically, bend to whatever it is that you want, you will hold them long enough before anybody who is in power will. And that is a true testament to what it is that has happened on the African continent. I think that without us basically not just revamping the educational system, but revamping the educational system with the intention of building in us us a mind that will be able to help us redefine who we are philosophically, incorporating our language, traditions, and values. There's really no way forward.
Exactly. Now, since we're discussing, this very important topic, many a times it's often said that the history of Africa was not written by Africans themselves, like you stated in your preamble. And now, to pick up from there, if we have to go practical, in changing certain things about the African continent, like you mentioned, Africa is moving forward. And moving forward means Africa needs to redefine its ideology. Africa needs to redefine, its norms, its values, so it can be able to be on the right path. I remember back in the days, children will sit, like it's often said on the African continent, that it takes a village, it takes a community to raise a child. And if the child has to grow forward, actually means every detail that the child knows has to be instilled in them by members of that community. Now, here is my question. If we have to go practical, given the society in which we find ourselves now, what does a decolonized education system in Africa, what would it look like?
Well, the reality is that we need to, first of all, begin to understand that language is as important as anything else. Exactly. And the reality is no African has English as their first language. True. We always have our traditional tongue, whatever that tongue will be, that is our first language. And a lot of research has been done, which basically shows that if you have a child that is educated in their first language, they do more better academically than if they do with the foreign language, which is basically a second language. That being said, and there's a lot of truth to that, because philosophical ideas, which is basically the template for which it is that we see society, and language is the way in which we build our philosophy and is the way in which we communicate. And so there are better ways in which we can be able to drive a particular point home if we're using our language. And I think that there's a lot of things that I understand fully if I'm speaking my traditional language as opposed to the English language. There's a lot of nuances, there's a lot of philosophical ideas. In most of my writings, I've actually gone back, to look at the structure of Mungaka, my traditional language, to be able to understand exactly why certain things are said the way they are, and to be able to extrapolate from that to build some great ideas, that I'm basically pushing across, in all of my speaking engagements around the world. That is primarily why we need to be able to make sure that we begin our educational system by revamping nothing else but language. Language is extremely very important. There is no reason why we can actually be talking about sovereignty on the continent of Africa when the very language we use in communicating is not African at all. That in itself, it's quite insane. Why are we using the English language? For what? Why don't we use Swahili? There are many other languages on the continent of Africa that I think that we can be able to use, and there are also languages which I think that has a lot to offer. Maybe Swahili, I have a little bit of reservations, because Swahili is basically laced with a lot of Arabic. You can be talking, I think, almost 40 or 60% of it, depending on the ratio, is actually Arabic. But the problem for me, especially when it comes to that, will really be just something that we need to be able to have conversations on. And I think that as long as the Islamic League has refused to basically, own up to the responsibility that almost 54 million Africans were young out of Africa through the trans-Sahara slave trade, where the men were masculated, they were basically castrated. There was a trail of blood moving through the Sahara, to Medina, and they did that because they didn't want black men procreating out in the Middle East. Unfortunately, if you go out to the Middle East, you will not find pockets of black people. Greater numbers were taken out into the Middle East now, and we had maybe half of that was taken to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade. But if you show up in the Americas, spanning from North to South America, you will find close to about 120 million black people who are indigenous, so to say, of this part of the world. Now, I needed to be able to make sure that, those in the Islamic or Arab community basically understands that this is not about trying to be able to say, we're not trying to demonize everybody, but it's just a statement of fact. That being said, Swahili might still be a good option, for those of us on the continent of Africa to be able to take that. I think that would be a good step forward. We cannot be talking about revamping this educational system if we do not change our language.
Exactly, and everything boils down to that, of course, embracing, our roots, embracing our cultures, embracing our norms and our traditions. Staying with you now, Dr. Fongod, in Egypt, for instance, the country has been taking steps in recent years to be able to, change the Western curricula that was imposed on the nation. But then they are trying as much as possible. I remember just recently, on Friday to be precise, we saw the South African President Cyril Matamela Ramaphosa, that was very much keen on reiterating the need to revamp the education system within his country, but that's, extends to the African continent. He stated that even it needs, children on the African continent leaving school, be it for 2 years, for instance, or 5 years, which is an example. And then everything changed. Even if it's the tutors, them having to embrace something that ties exactly with the norms that they are supposed to inculcate in these children. It will be better than having something that does not reflect society, that does not reflect the reality on ground or the context in which, the country and the continent to some extent finds itself. Now, with that said, should African countries, completely remove the colonial era curriculums that do exist, or should they integrate them into their indigenous knowledge?
There's nothing to be integrated. I think that we have to basically, yank out whatever is of the colonial legacy, take it out completely, and then start from scratch. I think it's the gypsies who says that give me a child when he is 7, I will show you a man. What that means is that between the age of 0 to 7 years old, you can actually be able to build a complete individual. After 7, it's very difficult to be able to do anything with that particular individual. But if you can train a child and be able to hound that child's skills and give them whatever skills set they need, by the time they become 7, you will absolutely be able to predict what they become in life. I think the gypsies basically knew this centuries ago. All right. So my point is, on the continent of Africa, we basically do not have any way in which we are able to instill our Africanness into, young Africans, and they grow up and all they're exposed to is MTV. It's, something being pushed out of Hollywood. They are not educated within the framework of what's African. So you have a little child who is growing up on the streets of Africa, who knows more about Washington, D.C. than they know about Dar es Salaam. You have a kid growing up somewhere in Accra, Ghana, who knows more about Hollywood than they will ever know about Nollywood. And so the idea becomes, we need to be able to foster this whole entire Africanness within our young ones, to be able to teach them, to be able to foster that and push that narrative. But let's do that with an Afrocentric mindset.
Exactly. It's all about putting Africa at the forefront. Now, Iliran, you mentioned the aspect of language within the context of the African continent. Amidst all that, we have these systematic changes that are taking place at this point in time. But then, how can we ensure that African history, like what you mentioned, knowing about the true history of Africa, one that is not being told by the West, the languages, the cultural languages, the true languages of Africans, the philosophies, that of Pan-African, that of Ubuntu within the context of the African continent, take the center stage as far as this revamping is concerned, as far as the overhaul is concerned within the context of the African continent, and to ensure that it continues being valorized on a daily basis on Africa.
If you were going to show up in a place like Washington, D.C., and you go over to the Congress and you just walk over into this gigantic building, which is the Congress, you walk over into a place called the Rotunda, you will be able to see the whole entire history of America, the last 200 years, you can be able to stand in that rotunda and picture after picture, statue after statue, all you'll be seeing is the history of this great nation being painted, all right, or being created, a sculpture or something, and in plain view of everyone to see. The problem with us Africans is that we have not learned how to be able to celebrate our own. And the reason for that is because we are preoccupied by celebrating every single thing else that is outside of the continent of Africa. Unfortunately, for the African, we are left now with the memories of, whatever happens in the United States of America or in Europe. At best, some things that took place in places like Russia. And we know nothing about Africa from an Afrocentric perspective. There is no African that is teaching us exactly who we are, and no government on the continent of Africa has taken upon herself to be able to create nothing else but, if not a museum, where we can be able to walk into and see who, when, and why. All right. See who did what, when they did it, and why it was done. We need to be able to begin to celebrate our own. If you walk on the streets of Africa and you ask an average African who is Mansa Musa, they will absolutely not know who that individual is. If you ask a young African, especially in places like Nigeria, or Ghana, about who is the richest person or who was the richest person who ever lived, the first thing will come out of their mouth is, if they're Christians, they will shout Solomon. Solomon was the richest person, but not knowing that the richest person who ever lived was a black man, a black king, who basically was king of the Malian Empire by name Mansa Musa. All right. And so that is the history of the African that is completely lost. And none of us, seems to be worried about the fact that you have a generation, or generations of young people, of Africans who basically do not care about the history of the African. That is quite disturbing. And I think that we need to be able to make sure that we begin this process, even in our entertainment and education. If you look at most of the kids shows that are produced in America, they all carries, a theme that basically foster the history of America. If you look at cartoon shows like Poco Hunters, all right, all carry movies, cartoons, movies, they all carry the history of this nation. Howbeit they put it in cartoons, because they're educating the young generation to be able to understand exactly the history of this great nation. If you look at China, China has the same thing. China spends a lot of time indoctrinating their young ones about being patriotic to China. All right, and being patriotic to the nation. I was having a conversation with somebody not long ago on the fact that if you look at an app like TikTok, it is absolutely very different from what you have outside of China. And in China, it is absolutely very different also. In China, that particular app basically pushed for one thing. It pushed for a desire for young people to become patriotic to China. That means anything that they see is something that fosters their desire for their nation. Their young people are being educated to love China. When it comes to Africa, who cares? We do not care anything. Who controls what? Nobody is controlling anything. Everything streams into the continent. We play all kinds of vulgar stuff on radio. We do not care, because there is no structure in place to be able to make sure that we do not indoctrinate our young people into all of this junk that is being pushed out from the West. We educate our young people into what is Afrocentric, our cultures, our values, our traditions, and our norms. That is not the case with us on the African continent. So we need to start from there and make sure that we're able to control what we feed our people. And I can honestly tell you, the diet we have been feeding the African is quite disturbing, to say the least.
At integrating, the mother tongue into their curriculum, but then recently it's been a trend even in Cameroon. Now, what's your appraisal of this latest move? Do you think that it is, in one way or the other, an advancement towards this a revamp we are expecting in the education system across the African continent?
at some of those STEM courses, that means science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, we need to be able to make sure that we get our young people into that, because that is basically the basis for the digital revolution that is basically sweeping across the world. Why the world is talking about AI, artificial intelligence, blockchain technology, we need to be able to make sure that we catch up. One of the saddest thing for me is being in this space is the fact that if you look at something like AI, artificial intelligence, one of the things is that all the models that are being used right now are being trained in the West. So China is basically training its own model, but most of the models that we use, especially on the African continent, is being trained in the West. The models are being trained on what considered to be a Eurocentric mindset. Okay, so I consider the West just Euro. So the Eurocentric mindset, it is not trained on an Afrocentric mindset. It's not trained by Africans, and so it's in the future. Imagine in the future where a young person on the African continent basically throws a prompt on something like ChatGPT or any of those AI models and asks a question that pertains to Africa. Whatever answer the young persons receive, he believes that is truth. But the only reason why he believes it's truth is because it's coming from something like ChatGPT, not knowing that ChatGPT is nothing else but a learning model, that the information fed into ChatGPT was biased to start with. So if you have a biased source of information that is being fed into an AI model, the AI model becomes defective from the jump, from the start. It becomes defective. We need to find ways on the continent of Africa where, at least for the love of God, have our own AI system, where we begin to train our own AI system with our own values, our own cultures, our own traditions, and our own norms. That is what we need to do. That is what we need to be able to invest most of our money on. And this, in a long run, will be able to help us and help young Africans not just boost up their morale, but as they begin to interact more with artificial intelligence platform, either they are building applications for different things, or they are basically using it for to run different stuff on the continent of Africa. At least the information that is coming out of the systems will be something else that it's in light to who they are as a people. You want a young child on the continent of Africa to basically be proud of who they are as Africans, so that whenever they throw a query or a prompt on any of these AI platforms, it should be able to say something about them that they are proud of. And if you throw in a prompt on any of these platforms, for example, in something like poverty or something like education, something like politics, whatever information comes out, I guarantee you is an information that was written by someone sitting in Washington, D.C. or in some European country, who basically wrote that not because they were speaking the truth concerning the continent of Africa, but primarily because they were writing it based solely from the vantage point of where they live, which is basically Europe, not Africa. I want Africans to tell Africa's story from an Afrocentric perspective. Let Africans speak for Africans.
Okay, I'll be coming back to you, to pick up on the question given us, asking about the integration of the mother tongue, into the curriculum across the African continent. But then before we proceed, let's listen to this excerpt, selected one of the addresses of the South African President Cyril Matamela Ramaphosa, where he was speaking, reiterating the need for a revamp in the education system across the African continent.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be here. This is one of my most favorite places to be, to talk about education, but more particularly to talk about something that we should have done 30 years ago. Minister, you were saying we need to admit where we've made mistakes, and I'm the first in government to admit that we made a mistake. We should have started with early childhood development. Universal early childhood development should have started 30 years ago. That's what we should have done. And I'm also on record in saying maybe what we should have done, because we had a legacy of Bantu education, is to close all schools maybe for 2 years. A good friend of mine is laughing because she has heard me talk about this. Close all schools for 2 years, take the educators, take them to re-education centers and have them re-educated so that they are ready to now teach the children properly. Yes, the children would have run around in streets without any education for 2 years, but that would have gained us a lot of time to be able to reform our education at an early stage. But as they say in the classics, it's never too late. It's better late than never. So we are 30 years late, but we are here today because of our shared belief, all of us here, in the profound importance of BANEH, putting our children first. This belief is in many ways the cornerstone of our vision for a brighter future for the people of our country and our country indeed. And it is because of this shared vision that we unite and, yes, collaborate together today, committed to ensuring that every child has the opportunity to learn, to grow, to thrive by the age of 5. I was talking to someone early this morning explaining where I'm going, and I asked that parent at what stage did she send her children to school. And she said, I sent my first child to early childhood learning at 8 months, and the second child at 1 year. And knowing those children as I do, they're bright sparks now. So starting early as a nation, and starting early as parents, getting our children into early learning, formalized early learning, is the absolute objective we must all chase. Our immediate focus is to extend access to early childhood development to every child. It is one of the most powerful levers that we have as a nation to unlock the potential of our future. We recognize today that investing in ECD is not just about education. It is about shaping the next generation of skilled, capable, as well as entrepreneurial citizens.
President Ramaphosa says child development is very important as it is better, or it achieves shaping the next generation. Now, Dr. FONGOD, do you share the same opinion as the South African president?
Yes, but I think that the idea that we should be able to, let educators basically off without teaching for 2 years, just so that they can be re-educated before bringing them back, it's basically quite antiquated. I don't think that idea basically makes any sense. We live in a digital age. What that means is we are able to get young people still in school and get educators trained simultaneously. So while we revamped the curriculum and basically show what the curriculum would be, we can actually begin to ease into the curriculum, whatever, not every single thing. As for example, language. If you have a kid in school which is studying mathematics, they're studying English, they're studying sciences, and they basically engineering, whatever they're doing in the science space, biology, those things basically will not change. What will change will be things about history, and then with economic principles that we basically agree to as Africans, and basically not just because we're Africans, because those economic principles do work. All right, so and then geography and a lot of other things within the social sciences. And I think that especially when it comes to philosophy and whatnot, I don't understand why. Of course, I'm a big time. I love Greek philosophy. Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. I think that those philosophers basically built Western civilization, and it is something basically to watch, especially if you are in that space. It's good. But yet there are a lot of other philosophers that we need need to be able to also look into. I mean, there are a lot of Kemetic philosophers that came out of Kemet. We have a lot of African philosophers in antiquity that we need to look at. My point is, if you're going to be able to do all of this stuff, we can still allow young people in school studying all of these other courses while we now begin to reintroduce ancient African history and who we are as a people, our philosophies back into the curriculum, and also getting teachers who are supposed to be teaching this particular stuff to get some kind of education online, and we just monitor them like that. There's no need to basically carry people and throw them in the classroom in this age and time on the basis that we are trying to shut down the whole entire educational system just to get a couple of people trained on what is it that they ought to have known in the first place. I think that is a great idea, but the method to which he is trying to implement it is quite problematic.
Okay, now earlier on you stated that there's a lot that needs to be done, within the context of Africa. With that said, you mentioned earlier on that technology could be used, to revamp the education system of different perspectives. But looking at the economic as well as social impact, can a decolonized education system within the context of Africa, drive economic transformation and some sort of self-sufficiency across the continent?
Absolutely. If you're going to start looking at education and you're basically trying to be able to incorporate the way the world is into our educational system, which is not this antiquated system that we've been learning, where young people get into the digital age, where STEM courses are actually being taught, science, engineering, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and you're able to actually get young people into this. Eventually you will get a lot of foreign direct investors who are basically coming into the continent, and the reason for that is because they know that whatever businesses that they are actually investing their money in, the skill sets are available on the continent to be able to run those businesses. And then eventually young people who basically are educated within the digital space will now be able to be employed irrespective of wherever they are on the continent of Africa, and they will be able to work with any company wherever they are. A couple of days ago, I was listening to a story of a young African who basically, got employed by a company in Nigeria that decided that they wanted to basically move into a digital age, and they needed to have a graphic designer that was working with them, and they employed this graphic designer, and the graphics designer, on the day he was supposed to show up at work, did not come to a physical office. So they called the guy. They're like, wait a minute, we employed you, and so how come you're not in the office? And he's like, what am I coming to the office to do? What you need to do is send me every single thing that you want me to do. I will do it and send it to you, and then you look at it and you say that's okay, and if that be the case, then that's what we do. So we have moved away from the traditional brick and mortar building where you basically walk in and sit in the place. We are now basically digitalized, decentralized. We are everywhere, and we can do everything from anywhere as long as we are basically connected to the internet. So this is basically the real definition of the internet of all things, because you can be anywhere and work anywhere. You can be in Cameroon and work for a company in Niger. You can be in Cameroon, work for a company in the United States, and there are folks who are actually in Cameroon, in Nigeria, in Ghana, doing jobs for companies that are outside of the continent of Africa. That is where we're supposed to be. So when you get a lot of young people educated and trained within this space, that is what basically brings about the transformation that we are looking for. And that is the best way in which we basically emerge from this colonial past and take our own futures into our own hands.
Exactly, and that is the part in which the African continent has been in recent years with this wind of change we've been seeing across the continent. And with that said, there's been this phenomenon that has been driving debates across Africa, brain draining, where we have potential talented African minds that end up traveling out of the African continent to seek what they call greener pastures elsewhere. Now, in your perspective, do you agree that the current education system is contributing to Africa's brain drain, and can a revamp a system within the continent of Africa help in reversing this trend?
Well, two things. Number one, I think that we need to be a little bit careful as we define what it even means for the brain drain, because there are two elements into this. First of all, there are people who are educated on the African continent whose skill sets are absolutely needed outside of the continent of Africa. For example, medical doctors and nurses. Those are folks who are educated in Africa and that are needed outside of Africa. If you go over to a place like the UK, there's a lot of Nigerians that are nurses that are working in the UK that were educated in Nigeria. Same with Cameroon, same with Ghana. They are working in the UK, they are in Canada, they are in the United States of America. So folks are basically, these countries are actually losing a lot of skilled workers that are supposed to be back home to help, especially, you know, in the health sector, but they are basically leaving. There are also a lot of young Africans who have basic education. Maybe, I don't know exactly how we define basic within the context of Africa, but maybe like a first degree, and then they leave the continent of Africa and they travel because there are no jobs, and so they're looking for greener pastures somewhere else, you know, outside of the continent of Africa, and that in itself also is somewhat of a brain drain so far as the countries are concerned. What we need to do eventually is this: that if we revamped the educational system, the first thing that will happen is we will be able to open up the job market, because if you have the skill sets to be able to do something, you will not need to wait to be employed. You will create the jobs. So to say, number one. Number two, we will be able to get foreign direct investors who will come into the country to be able to invest into different sectors of the economy. Reasons being, there are the skill sets, people who are skilled enough to operate those machines or to work in whatever you know, industries that is being set up by these foreign corporations. They will be able to have the labor back home. One of the most I think that one of the most easiest thing to see is if you look at a country like the Philippines, and if you shop in the Philippines, especially in Manila, they are close to about 1,000 Cameroonians that are working in Manila, and all of them are perfectly bilingual, and that is the only reason why they're working in those call centers. So they pick up tech calls, you know, tech support calls from companies that are in France and also in Canada. So what is happening is this, that the economy of Manila is basically, you know, the Philippines is doing well, and they are employing all of these Africans who comes from Cameroon and some other African countries. As long as you're able to speak French and English, as long as you're bilingual, you're good to go. And the issue is Cameroon, that basically has, you know, a lot of young Africans who basically are bilingual. We are the only ones who are missing on this. Reasons being that instead of having these folks travel out of the country to go and work in another country where they pay taxes, why don't we just have the environment where this can be able to work in a place like Cameroon? But unfortunately, that's not always the case. And so we need to be able to make sure, not just that we are revamping the educational system, we need to be able to make sure that in terms of our policies, especially when this is to the government now, we need to create an environment where some of these corporations and companies can be able to flourish within the context of the country, so that we can be able to do what we're supposed to do. Without which, it will always be the case that folks keeps leaving, and the reason for that is because the environment in itself does not permit for any kind of economic growth. So why will I stay in a country when I have mouths to feed, you know, when I'm thinking about how to better my life and improve my standard of living, when I know there are opportunities outside of the country? I will basically leave, no questions asked. And unfortunately, that's the mode of operation for most Africans. We need to be able to create an environment on the African continent, you know, that allow for young Africans to have a reason to stay home, and not just stay home, but have the opportunity to flourish and build up skill sets that is needed, you know, so that they can be able to either enter into the job market or create jobs themselves.
Speaking of getting into the job market, like you mentioned, there are so many skill sets, so many skills that could be gotten and could be implemented on the African continent for, I know, the emergence of the continent of Africa. Now, from your perspective, like you've been mentioning since the start of the show, How can we balance, the modern global skill sets, which you said could be acquired maybe via the use of technology, through STEM and so on and so forth, with the local knowledge that Africans already have to prepare students, or better still, the young Africans that are still learning for both African and international job markets? And to what extent can AI and other tools be implemented?
Well, I think the first thing is that we need to be able to work with young Africans and build a robust e-learning platforms that young Africans everywhere they are on the continent of Africa can have access to, so they can be getting the education from day one that they will otherwise not have so far as their school systems are structured. And I think that if all the governments on the continent of Africa actually invested a lot of money in this, we will be training a lot of young people on the African continent to gain skill sets, that they will otherwise not have if they went to our traditional school systems. And I think that those are the first things that we need to do. And it will be relatively cheap for every single Africans to have access to. All you really need to do is to be able to have some kind of an internet access. And if we do this properly in certain countries and certain environments, you will not even need internet access to have access to this network. For example, we can partner with companies like MTN, where you should be able to have access to educational materials without, needing data. It will just be a free service that the government basically sponsors and basically come into partnership with these tech companies so that we can get young people, educated and allow them to be able to have access to the so much needed training that they need to be able to have. Those are the first things that we need to do so far as bringing educational materials to young people on the continent of Africa is concerned. That would be a very good thing to do. I don't think that there's any other thing else left than bringing education to the people who need it the most. And if we do so, then we will be able to get a lot of young people, ready for the job market. I don't care what you study in most of our school systems. The question becomes, there are no jobs. There are no jobs. You have folks educated in places like Nigeria, and places like Ghana, and places like Cameroon that picks up files every single day, and they walk on the capital, the streets of the capital looking for jobs. And then they're wondering why no one is hiring them. The problem is that the job market is also changing, and you are not skilled enough to be hired for anything. All that you studied in school meant nothing. That is the problem with the educational systems that we have. The job market is changing, and there's something about demand and supply. So if you look at it critically, there are people who basically, especially even in the United States of America, there are people who have no first degree, no advanced degree, but they just have high school plus some tech training, and they're making, six figures, and they're doing very well. And the problem is because the job market is demanding for that skill set. So we need to be in an environment where before you embark on any kind of training, stop saying, I'm doing this because the government will. The government basically will frustrate the living daylight out of you. You will basically the government will make you sick. The government will make you very, very sick. Just to let you know how sick the government will make you become, you need to start asking questions like this. If the government promised that, if it was promised by the government that they're going to build a road, and the road has not been constructed for the last, 50 years, what makes you think that you have any guarantee that if you study anything in the name of you be employed by the government, that you basically have access to whatever it is that you've been, promised? That stuff is not going to work out. You have to basically start thinking about how you create whatever it is. If you're going to have any kind of education, think about basically getting into education because you can create the job that you need. You can be able to do whatever it takes to be self-sufficient and have a self-reliant life, based upon the educations that you have, not based upon a promise, to study something that means that you will now have to rely on the government for employment. You will be disappointed.
Well, we've been having discussions around these issues, social issues that have been plaguing the African continent, notably corruption, embezzlement, and so on and so forth. Now, what might be the biggest challenges that could be faced in terms of trying to reform the education system on the continent of Africa? and what stands to resist some of these social ills, do you believe to some extent that might, hinder the progress in getting some of the, some of the results that you have stated so far?
Corruption will always be there, and I think that it's going to be very difficult for us to weed out corruption the way we know it. And the only way for us to weed out corruption is my own idea, and I don't think that anybody really likes my idea, but I'm going to state my idea anyway. So this is the way I see corruption, right? So if I became the president of any country on the African continent, day one, the first thing I'm going to do is I will close up all offices. First of all, I will shut down every single embassy. I don't care exactly which those embassies will be able to shut down for at least a month. That being said, I will close down every ministry. All of them. I don't care exactly who. I'll close everything down. Bring all directors, ministers, and everybody else. I'm not firing anyone. I'll bring all of them to a big stadium, like a big soccer stadium, right? And then I will ask them one question. You see, you can leave now if you know that corruption is something that is enshrined in your blood. You can leave now, or if not, you will have to sign this contract which states that in the event that you steal anything, the day we catch you, it is capital punishment. The day we catch you, on that day we catch you, is capital punishment. So have these conversations with your family if that's really what you want to do. All right? And you'll soon discover that there are people who basically will just tell you, you know what? We call it quit because it's enshrined in us, we can do it. Or folks will basically have conversations with their family and says, hey, you know what, life would have to change for a bit, and we have to do what is needful and what is right for the country. And I think that that's the way we go ahead with it. To state that we are going to be able to weed out corruption, all right, we need to wipe out a whole entire generation. All right, so we need to wipe out like 2 or 3 generations. There are young people who are trying to be able to get into places of power, who have been indoctrinated that the only way you can get into places of power is because you have to be as corrupt as the person who is in power. That is a very dangerous precedent. So you have 2 to 3 generations of people who are absolutely corrupt, and the only person who is not corrupt, okay, it's those who basically can run nothing and can do nothing because they are still infant. There are certain countries on the continent of Africa that everybody is a thief. As a matter of fact, if you really wanted to lock somebody, like there's a place in Yaoundé called Kondengui or something like that, if you really, or Krikri in Nigeria, if you really wanted to lock people up, you probably might just have to build a gigantic fence across the country because everybody is in prison. All right, that's just the way it is. That's the level of corruption we have so far as the continent is concerned. For us to fix that corruption has to basically means that we need to be able to have what those boys in the Sahel are doing, and that is the only way in which you basically put an end to this madness. If that's the only way you put an end to this, I'm not pushing or promoting that, but I'm saying to you that in the event that you really think about putting an end to corruption, you must be able to do things that will be considered very controversial. That's the way you end this madness.
Well, many a time there have been this notion across Africa that, well, education systems will be changed, corruption will be swept out, embezzlement is going to be targeted, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, it ends up being just a political slogan. So with this, this latest move, this latest talk that is taking place, where we are seeing the call for Africa to revamp its education system, do you believe, or what can governments do on the African continent to ensure that it's not another political slogan, or better still, it leads to real change, actual change, one that reflects, the true nature of the African continent, the African people and their values?
I think that for us to be able to really weed out corruption, it must begin with the philosophy. I think that our philosophy has to change. And the reason why our philosophy would change is because our philosophy basically will have to be able to be the window to which it is that our morality is built. And so our philosophy basically instructs our morality instructs what we do, and what we do is a reflection of who we are. And as a result of that, if we start thinking about corruption based upon the kind of philosophy that we'll have, then it will basically curb out corruption out if we have the good philosophy or the right form of philosophy that we are practicing as Africans. That's the first thing that we need to do. Secondly, the thing that is of utmost importance is this, that if we basically improve the standard of living for everybody else with the right philosophy, then that will make sense that the temptation for somebody who is just trying to make a buck or two because their salary is absolutely nothing, standard of living is rising, cost of living is rising, and yet the only thing that is not rising is the salary, that basically does not help. If somebody is living in a city where let's say somewhere in Cameroon, for example, you're in the city of a place like Douala and you are making 100,000, all right, and your rent is 80,000, you know, and you have 20,000 to eat. I mean, there's just nothing you can do. And so that same individual will have to go to an office and then he will hold people's documents hostage because he's looking for, you know, 1,000 or 2,000 to be able to push, you know, those documents forward. Have you not noticed that if you show up anywhere in Cameroon or let me speak for the ones I know, like in Cameroon, you go from one office to another office, you need to be able to use you have your documents that is supposed to move from one desk to another for signatures. If that paper is not moving with an envelope, nothing absolutely gets done. It's just the way it is. Cameroon, Nigeria, Ghana, you name it. Corruption is everywhere on the continent of Africa. That is the problem that we face. My thing is, the only way for us to be able to solve this is to improve on the quality, on the standard of living, make sure that a lot of people are paid well, but also change the philosophy. Because if you educate the thief, instead of him stealing, all right, if you educate a thief, instead of him stealing, you know, just small amount of monies in the office and whatnot, he will steal the whole entire nation. And that is what has happened to most of our political leaders. People who got educated overseas came back and basically discovered that there are better ways in which they can yank out the whole entire the resources we have in the nation, and that is exactly where we are. I think that we must be able to change our philosophy. There has to be a way in which we build a philosophy in the minds of young Africans, and let that philosophy be an Afrocentric one that teaches our values, our cultures, our traditions, and our norms. And believe me, Africans are not thieves.
And now, speaking of a change of ideology, a change of philosophy, do you think that the ideology of Pan-Africanism, Ubuntu on the African continent can go a long way in, you know, phasing out some of the social ills and to some extent decolonizing the education system on the African continent?
Absolutely. And I think that if you basically understand anything about Pan-Africanism, one of the core values of Pan-Africanism is love for the continent and black peoples all across the world. So if you basically love, you know, the continent and black peoples around the world, you will basically do whatever it takes to make sure that the continent become the best that it can be. The value of being a Pan-African is not that you just shout, I'm a Pan-African. No, it's that you instill in young people the desire to be able to love the continent in ways that they have never seen before. That is the values of being a Pan-African, which is enshrined in each and every one of us. We need to be able to value the motherland. The continent is home. The continent is ours. We need to be able to value it. One of the things that I will say is this, especially when it comes to all of these people who are in power. You know, the day you were born, you were and you are still on a procession, and that procession is not to greatness. That is the fallacy. Some people become great along the line. It doesn't mean anything. That procession is a procession to the grave. Each and every one of us, when we wake up every single morning, we are waking up to a new day, and it's not a new day away from the grave. It is a new day closer to the grave, which means each and every one of us, we are dying. We are dying daily. You are not dying, you know, you are not living daily, but the reality is that you are actually dying daily. The desire for each and every one of us to be the best that we can be is great, is good. But to be able to leave a legacy by building a continent that is truly, you know, home of our ancestors is something that each and every one of us should be able to emulate. We must be able to look at previous Pan-Africans, people like Kwame Nkrumah. We must be able to look at the life of people like Muammar Gaddafi. We must be able to look at people like Thomas Sankara. We have to look at all of these people, Patrice Lumumba, and ask ourselves questions like this. What is it that made these people who they are, and what was it that drove them to be able to build this robust Pan-African agenda that has basically foiled Pan-Africanism across the world? We have to be able to instill that in our young people. Without that, it will be extremely quite difficult for us to be able to push this whole entire virus of corruption outside of the continent of Africa. If you know that you are not going to live this life alive, if you know that the only way to exit this life is in death, and there's nothing you can do about it, you will start building legacies, because there's not too many things you can eat, not too many cars you can drive, not too many private jets you can have. Frankly speaking, none of those stuff means anything, because in the end, you will still end up in a box. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people who are so demented that they don't even see that. The reality is this, and I think that the first thing that we should teach every single African kid in the university, when they get into the university, the first lecture, 101, it's a lecture I like to teach in any major university. It should be titled, "You Are Dying." And that simply means whatever you do it as fast as you can, so that you can be able to leave a legacy, not just for you, but for the next generation that is coming after you. You are a piece of a puzzle, and that piece of a puzzle is for you to push this civilization forward, even if it's just an inch, even if it's just 1 centimeter. You don't have to do more than that, but for the love of God, leave this place better than you made it. That's all we ask for. And I think that that's what a Pan-Africanism or Pan-African agenda basically looks at. Leave the continent 1 centimeter, just one, better than you made it. You will be making our ancestors proud. And obviously, corruption will no longer be an issue.
Exactly. And of course, while we're talking about this change, we are discussing, having a revamp, an overhaul in the education system of the African continent. But Dr. FONGOD, from your perspective, looking at this issue of foreign aid in the African continent, do you believe that Africa can actually drive for its own, its own education system, one that prioritizes the values of African people, without having this issue of foreign aid coming in to support the education system heavily on the continent of Africa? How can Africa go about that?
The first thing is this: if you're going to look at the continent of Africa, there's one thing that you must be able to appreciate. What you appreciate is the diversity we have in relationship to the many cultures that we have on the continent of Africa, and the many languages that we do have so far as the continent is concerned. We are multicultural, we are multi-ethnic across the continent of Africa, and that is something that is remarkably beautiful. And if you basically step back and look at all the beautiful colors that the continent has, our language, our norms, cultures, and all of that, it paints a beautiful mosaic picture that is just remarkable, and is a testament to the beauty that the continent holds. We must be able to extrapolate that into our economies, and the reason for that is because we must be able to diversify so far as economies are concerned. If there's no economic diversification, it will be extremely very difficult for any particular nation, to be basically thrive. Most of our educational systems, especially when it comes to our government, has been so monolithic. That means it's just one single idea. We have like 4 major things that you can study if you want to work with the government. You can either become a teacher, work in some government school. You can basically probably do something recently in mining and then work with the Ministry of Mines, or you basically become a doctor and work in some government hospitals. The question becomes, it is extremely very difficult to be able to talk about employment, because how many people do you possibly think can the government really hire? All right, the government, is saturated, and the government is not a for-profit making mechanism. It's not a for-profit making organization. It is run as an NGO. They spend money they do not have. They tax people to the high heavens because they are trying to be able to spend money they do not have. We must be able to educate young people and then push them into the private sector, not to push them into the public sector. The private sector, these are the people that basically builds up our economy, and we must be able to do so. Diversification. When we get young people to begin to get into all these other educations that are not primarily being taught in our own educational systems, especially something within the STEMs, the digital space, okay, if we're able to do that, then what that means is we are opening the job market. We are opening the market for a lot of other things, industrialization that basically flows towards what it is that these young people are studying. If you look at a place like Boya, I heard about a place out there called the Silicon Valley and of Boya, which basically just means that, I think Silicon Mountain they call it, which is just young people that are primarily doing what they need to do in terms of technology. And these are the things that needs to happen. So the beauty of the continent will come as a result of young people doing what they need to do, being educated in the right things, and then creating jobs within those spaces. And foreign direct investors will now be able to come in, see what is going on, and then putting money into those spaces. Secondary industries will emerge as a result of the fact that those primary industries are developing, and that is how you're able to build up a very good ecosystem within a particular space with thousands of young people being employed. Reasons being, all we did was just change something within the educational system, or we gave a lot of tools to young people on e-learning platforms where they were able to hone certain skills, and then from there, brought certain employment opportunities, not just to themselves by building these companies, but to a lot of young people who basically will now see what is going on, either join them or create their own. That's the beauty of basically revamping the educational systems that we have.
And of course, it's worth noting that you acknowledge one of your responses. You stated that it's imperative for Africans to embrace, digital skill sets for the benefit of the African continent, but also you equally stated that there is need for collaboration within the continent of Africa. Now, speaking of this collaboration, do you believe that African nations coming together could go a long way in framing a unified education framework that would reflect the true values, the true history, the true identity of Africans? And to some extent, if the African education system is revamped, in your perspective, what would that look like in
which means that nations on the African continent basically needs to come together. We need to have experts with all of these studies across the continent to create a superstructure or a super curriculum that will enable young Africans on the continent of Africa to learn the history of the continent from an Afrocentric perspective. That's what we need to do. I think that it has to be great collaboration across the continent. Every single nation on the continent of Africa has a story to tell. Every single nation on the continent of Africa has her own heroes, and I think that it is her responsibility to share those heroes with the rest of the world and with the rest of us on the African continent. We are one people, and we need to be able to celebrate that.
We are one people indeed. If you're just joining us, this is Talking Point on 4U Media Africa, where we discuss matters now affecting the African continent. And now, to wrap up today's edition of the program, Dr. FONGOD, in your perspective, from your own opinion or standpoint, what is the way forward, and what parameters should be put in place as Africa moves forward with this agenda of revamping its education system?
If you look at the population of the continent of Africa, we probably above 30% of young people are not employed. And the reason for that is either that they are not educated within the right stuff, which basically means that you're able to find someone with a first degree in something like literature, first degree in something like European history or some weird studies, okay, who's riding a motorbike for transportation. I think it's called bench in places like Cameroon, Keke in places like Nigeria, who is doing that just because they have to make a living. What that means is this, that the educational system in itself has failed, and we need to be able to find ways in which we start educating young Africans to be job market ready within the 21st century. That means they have to be educated with the right things, and then so that they can become employed, or if not, use their skill sets to be able to do something. And the education that we need on the African continent have to be a self-reliance type of education. The education where you live, you graduate, and if you are not able to gain any employment from any company, you should have enough skill sets to be able to set something by yourself, scale it up, build it up, and then start employing other people. And I think that that will be the best things to do if we are to do anything so far as the continent is concerned. Our educational system for sure has flopped, but I'm hopeful that within this digital space, if we are able to just redirect the focus of young people away from social media platforms that will not benefit them in any way, and then bring them to a platform where they can really be able to learn certain skills that will be able to help these governments on the continent of Africa, basically grow as well. Because as the economy grows, foreign direct investors will come in. There'll be a lot of foreign direct investments, and then that will basically boost up the economy. GDP is going up, and then human economic index too will be rising, because obviously as the standard of living rises, a lot of people will feel good in these countries. They will love exactly the environment in which they're living in, and that will be in the overall health of the economy. That is the way going forward. I believe, without a shadow of a doubt, that better days are coming so far as the continent is concerned. And the reason for that is because be having greater and greater number of penetrations of internet service connectivity into the rural areas. The only thing I'm a little bit concerned about is the fact that we need to be able to manage the energy sector. If the energy sector is not well managed, then internet penetration into these areas will not mean that much, reasons being that these devices that connects to the internet needs to be charged. One way or the other, we must be able to make sure that the continent becomes energy independent, and that will be the template to which it is that an emerging Africa that has to do, with an educational system that has been totally revamped, educating young people in the stem cells and into the STEM courses, educating young people into the digital space. That will be the template to which it is that Africa emerges. But I think that internet penetration, which is on the rise, is good, but we have to basically address the issues of energy.
Thank you immensely, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, for your insightful contribution on today's edition of Talking Point.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me.
Like you rightly said, it's left in the hands of Africans, especially those at the helm, to be able to take or drive this change needed on the African continent. But each and every African has a role to play. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's